Hey friend, welcome back to the 1-year Bible journey right here on Growing in the Gospel. I'm Pastor Cary, and I'm so glad you've joined me. Today, we are starting week 43. I just want you to pause for a minute and think about this. Out of 52 weeks, you're 43 weeks in. And this has been such a rewarding journey. It's been a lot of hard work for you and for me, both of us. But we've taken this journey, and I'm glad we've taken it. I'm glad you stuck with it. However long it's taken you, whatever week you're on, I hope you'll stick with it because you're so close to the end. We're so close to finishing God's Word together all the way through. And then all the materials here for you to start again if you'd like to, and it will be. So anyway, week 43, here we go. This is the Old Testament video. So this week your reading is the entire book of Lamentations. Now, don't worry, it's just 5 chapters, but then you're going to start into the book of Ezekiel, which is 48 chapters, but we're only going to do Ezekiel up through chapter 8. So Lamentations through Ezekiel 8. And then in the New Testament, you're going to read Hebrews 1 through 5. We'll talk about that in tomorrow's New Testament video. And then Psalm 123 to 125. Okay. Let's talk about these two books, Lamentations and Ezekiel. I think the very first thing I want to tell you is that this week's reading and the next couple weeks that we're in Ezekiel is going to be kind of difficult reading, okay? So we had some hard reading early on, Leviticus, part of Numbers. We had some long genealogies and stuff going on later. We've come through Isaiah, parts of that were pretty dense. Jeremiah, parts of that are pretty dense. Ezekiel's one of those it's one of the more obscure books, okay? Lamentations is hard for a different reason. Lamentations is a lament. So it's tearful. It's a lament, okay? I don't know another word for it. It's almost like a funeral dirge, okay? So let's talk about why it's hard. Lamentations is hard because it is recounting suffering that is being brought about at the hand of God, but as a result of paganism, as a result of sinfulness and wickedness. And we'll talk about how do we process that in a few minutes. But then, but it's hard because it's recounting suffering. And yet, even in the hardness, there's some sweet spots in Lamentations that are going to bless you. If you're suffering, if you're going through hardship, I can tell you when I had cancer, Lamentations was a go-to book. I mean, it was a place to park my heart and my sorrow and my grief. If you've suffered, if you are grieving a loss, this is a place to sit with God in sorrow. And the fact that this book is in Scripture as preserved words of God tells you that God weeps with you, and He feels what you feel, even though He's permitting it, and He's going to redeem it, and He's going to work it together for good. That's what He does. It's still not His first plan. Okay, the fall He knew about the fall, but He didn't cause the fall. So the existence of sin and evil and wickedness is not to be blamed on God, but God is responding to it, and He will deal with sin and wickedness and evil, and He will overcome it and work all of its ultimate worst. He'll work it together for good. But sometimes you don't want to hear that. You just need to sit in the sorrow, and that's what Lamentations is. It's Jeremiah sitting in the sorrow and finding God in the depth of the dark places of life. That's why it's lament. So let me talk to you about the word lament, because some of the Psalms are lamentations as well. They're laments. What is that? To lament is to grieve with God, in the presence of God, in view of the grace and mercy of God. So it is to feel your sorrow fully. It is to mourn your sorrow fully, but not against God, instead with God. It's raw, it's brutal, it's honest, but it is not rebellious. It is running to God with the wound and with the sorrow and the grief and the tears, and sitting with him and letting him sit with you in it, feeling it 100%, but processing it in view of the true heart of God and the true promises and eternal purposes of God, which makes even lament hopeful. And you're going to see that in Lamentations. So that's what it means to lament. And it is counter to the prosperity gospel. It's counterintuitive to, the karmic version of, if we just scratch God's back, he'll scratch ours too. If we just get a little religion and do a little moral behaviorism, then God will work things out for us. The idea that when you get Christianity, you get a free pass from trouble. That is a false gospel. No, the gospel is not an escape from trouble. It's a resource in it and through it. The gospel is what gives you hope that holds you together when everything else is coming apart. And that's what Lamentations helps us to see. So what is Lamentations? Lamentations is Jeremiah, again. It's like a continuation of the book of Jeremiah. The author of is Jeremiah. It's Jeremiah sitting, many believe, in a grotto, a cave, that is not very far from Golgotha, the place of the skull, and from the garden tomb. It's on the north side of the old city. In modern day, it's in an Arab neighborhood just outside of the Damascus Gate. If I'm not messing this up, I think it's called Jeremiah's Grotto. But most scholars believe that as Jerusalem fell, as Jerusalem was being demolished and pillaged and falling apart under the Babylonians, Jeremiah sat there in that grotto looking on the devastation, or the devastation that was about to be, and he wrote Lamentations while he was weeping and grieving. So it is Jeremiah sitting with God, lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem in late 586 BC and the carrying away of the captives, the Hebrews, to Babylon, which we've talked so much about. And more deeply, Jeremiah is lamenting his own sin and at times his own rebellion, as well as the broader, deeper sin and rebellion of the people. If this book feels confusing, then you're reading it right, okay? Because it is. It is the confused reasoning of a confused man trying to make sense out of the goodness of God that has resulted in chastening and judgment of God temporarily on his home and on his people and on his city. So it is confusing because it's born out of confusion. Another thing I would tell you about this book is that it is hard to track who's talking. Is it Jeremiah talking? Is it God talking? Is it the city talking? Because it's kind of back and forth, and at times it's like all three. Like, who's weeping? Is Jerusalem weeping? Is Jeremiah weeping, or is God weeping? And the answer is they're all three weeping, okay? When we're talking about in first person the sin, sometimes it's the city of Jerusalem, like personified, and Jeremiah speaking in first person, almost writing as if he is the city and the city is him. But then you'll read about weeping and you'll wonder who's weeping, and is it God or Jeremiah? And the answer is yes, it's both of them. And it's brutally beautiful because it is Jeremiah being confused and honest and just in a stream of conscious thought, expressing his heart, emotions, and devastation to God. But it's inspired by God because God is sitting there with him, and so it is God preserving these thoughts. And it's really God saying to us he understands the depth of our feelings, and he empathizes even when it has to do with his own chastening. So it's hard reading in that it's sorrowful, and it could confuse you about the nature and the heart of God because by the end of chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3, early in chapter 3, you don't really want to know this God. I mean, if it would make the worst sales pitch, chapters 1, 2, and the first 20 verses of chapter 3, anybody reading those chapters and verses would just be like, why would I want to know this God? But Jeremiah he's going to, in his confusion, go low. But remember, this is to God, with God, in the presence of God, lamenting. And by verse 21 of chapter 3, it dawns on him that not everything is hopeless, and God is not as bad as he is feeling that he is. Okay, so let's break down this book for a minute. Chapter 1 is the mourning over and for the city of Jerusalem. It's all about the city. It's broken, it's destitute, the city is in a terrible condition. In verse 16, the city weeps, and there's no one to comfort. But in verse 18, Jeremiah says, but God is right. I know God is right. And everyone can look and learn from this situation. The city is mourning and waiting for God to finish punishing the surrounding enemies that have done these things. And the city is groaning with terrible sickness. Chapter 2 is the description of God's wrath because of sin. So the Lord has essentially destroyed his own temple, his own holy place, caused all of his own feasts and holy days to cease because they'd all become pagan in nature. He's broken down the walls of the city and the gates of the city. Verse 11, Jeremiah cries until he can't cry anymore. And he is saying, who has ever seen any sorrow or hopelessness or despair like this? He asks this intuitive question, who can heal? Who can make this right? It's as though he's doubting God, because he's the same guy that said in Jeremiah, in the book of Jeremiah, God's going to restore, God's going to rebuild, God's going to do all these things. But in this moment, he's surely questioning, how could this ever come back? We need Lamentations, okay, because it shows us the human view of those who trust God, that they still doubt, they still wrestle with questions. What is happening? How could this ever come back? And this is why the fact that Jerusalem exists today as a thriving city is a miracle, because there was a moment in time when any living human being would have thought, this is never coming back. Who could ever restore this? And that's why the answer is only God. And that's why the fact that there is a Jerusalem today is huge proof that God is real and true and faithful and trustworthy. So Jeremiah sets it at the feet of the false prophets and the people who have rebelled and rejected the true word of God. And he ends up asking in this chapter, Lord, why would you allow such brutality and bloodshed? Chapter 3, the first part, you're going to start yawning now that I did that. The first part of chapter 3 is Jeremiah expressing his own personal afflictions, that he has been acquainted with the afflictions that God has brought in his own life, and God chastening and purging and purifying him. He's lived the life of a man that seems at times to be forsaken. And you might ask at this point, is this Jeremiah, or is this the city, or is this both? And my sense is that it's kind of both. Jeremiah is suffering, he's homeless, he is hopeless, and he's just deeply, profoundly grieving at this moment. But then, verse 21, this I recall to mind, and therefore have I hope. This I recall to my mind, therefore have I hope. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed. Hey, it's mercy that I'm even sitting here alive right now. It's mercy that I can write these words, that I can sit here with God, that I can come to him. It's mercy that we're not totally and utterly consumed forever, because his compassions fail not. I'm reading you from chapter 3. They're new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. So here's a man that says, God filled me with poison. He's filled me with bitterness and wormwood. But now a few verses later, he says, God's compassion is flowing free, and his mercies are new every morning, and his faithfulness is great. And don't we love that great hymn? Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. So these are verses that we love. We build our lives on these verses, but we don't realize they're preceded by 2.5 chapters of hardship, and suffering, and darkness, and doubt, and question, and despair. So verse 24, the Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore will I hope in him. The Lord is good to them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. It is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. And Jeremiah continues now through this chapter talking about the hope that only God can give. Well, chapter 4 is God's justice fulfilled, the wealthy and powerful being brought low, justice being done. It's a terrible chapter, cannibalism unfolding in the city, and the Lord allowing these things to happen in Jerusalem that no one would have ever thought possible. But then still in this chapter, my nose is itching and I'm so sorry. Jerusalem, this punishment will end and you will return. One day you'll be restored. Chapter 5 is Jeremiah's prayer for restoration. The city is devastated and destitute, but Lord, you remain forever. Restore us, Lord. Turn us back to you, unless you've rejected us forever. It's interesting to me that even though he knows God hasn't rejected them forever, and God's promised multiple times through Jeremiah's preaching that he's going to restore the city, still at the end of Lamentations, Jeremiah has to land the book with that seed of human doubt. It just shows you that followers of God throughout the centuries are just as human as you or me. So that is Lamentations, short book, heavy book, but some real gems in this book. And now we move on to Ezekiel. And we're going to spend several weeks in Ezekiel, so I'll just introduce this at a high end and talk you quickly through these first 8 chapters that you're going to read. So Ezekiel is named after its author, Ezekiel. He was a Jewish man that was exiled early in the early waves of the exiles to Babylon. So before the city fell, Ezekiel was picked up by the Babylonians and taken to Babylon. He was 30 years old. He had dreamed of being a priest. He had trained for the priesthood in Jerusalem. His 30th birthday, he's supposed to become a priest in Jerusalem. But where is he on his 30th birthday? He's sitting on the banks of the Chabad River in Babylon. It's an irrigation canal. There's a refugee camp right outside the city of Babylon. It's filled with Hebrew exiles. So Ezekiel's life has come crashing down. He's not a priest. He's not in Jerusalem. His dreams are devoured. He's in the last place a Jewish person would want to be, pagan Babylon, arch enemies of God. He's there by God's decree, and it's sitting on the banks of that river on his 30th birthday that he opens the book. We'll come back to what happens when he opens the book and begins to tell us. But he's one of 10,000 other Jews. He prophesies for 22 years in Babylon. His message was to the people that are in captivity, in exile, and who are there continuing their rebellion. Can you believe it? They rebelled in Jerusalem. God chastened them from their rebellion by taking them into exile, and they're still rebelling. And Ezekiel's basically like a street preacher in Babylon crying out to the rebellious Jews who are still defying God and who are unbudging, unrepentant in their unbelief. So it's remarkable that God gets his message to those who need it. He made sure that they had the word, the truth that they needed to be able to act on and do what they needed to do so that they would be without excuse because he's just. There's two parts to the book. 48 chapters are broken down this way. Chapters 1 to 32 is God's judgment for sins. Chapters 33 to 48 is God's hope for the future. So let's talk. And the theme of this book is judgment and restoration. Judgment and restoration. Like so many of the prophets, judgment and restoration. And remember, prophet, specific messenger to specific people with a specific message at a specific place and context in specific circumstances. Okay, so we can't just draw a straight line from Ezekiel to us. There's going to be takeaways, there's going to be applications, but this is a message to Hebrew exiles in Babylon and how they, rebels, I should say, who are defying God even though they're in exile. So chapter 1, Ezekiel doesn't even want to be where he is, but guess what? God comes to where he is. He can't be where God is. He thinks God's back in the temple in Jerusalem, but God brings the temple presence in a big way to Ezekiel and sweeps him up into a heavenly vision, frankly, into the throne room. It's very similar to Daniel's experience in the throne room and to John in Revelation, their experience in the throne room of heaven. I love chapter 1 and verse 3. And the hand of the Lord was there upon him, on that dusty, dry, desert riverbank outside of Babylon, that irrigation canal. The hand of the Lord is upon him there. You might think you are so far away from the blessing of God, and his hand is right upon you, right where you are. It's so cool. Chapters 2 and 3 is Ezekiel's call and his commission. And God is sending Ezekiel to Israel and tells them, don't fear them. Give them the message, whether they listen or not, and most of them aren't going to listen. He gives them a scroll and tells them to eat it. It's symbolic of take in the message that I'm going to give you to give out. He sends Ezekiel to the exiles with a message and tells them not to be afraid of them. This vision and call gives Ezekiel great bitter feelings and emotional turmoil. He doesn't want to do this, doesn't want to be where he is, doesn't want to live in the story that God's writing for his life. But God's hand is strong. And when Ezekiel finds himself back at the river, at the camp of the exiles, he sits there by the river, completely shocked and overwhelmed for 7 days. You ever feel that way? Just dumbfounded? I feel that way sometimes. After 7 days, God kind of says, snap out of it, Ezekiel. I've appointed you a watchman. Warn these people. If you do not warn them, I'm going to hold you responsible. If you do, and they don't do what you've warned them, then they will be held responsible. By verse 22, God leads Ezekiel out to a valley where he encounters God again. God sends him home where he essentially binds him and silences him until he gives them a message and tells them some are going to listen, but some and most will not. Chapter 4, Ezekiel is told to do something strange. Make a map of Jerusalem and show it under siege, and then go lay it out and lay on your side for the number of days that equals the sin of the northern kingdom, Israel, and the sin of the southern kingdom, Judah, which is 390 days plus 40 days to lay on your side, and only eat a certain amount of food, a certain point of the day, cooked over a fire made of dung, of refuse, of you know the different words for it, and a measure of water every day. It's a strange assignment, but what is it? It's God's visual message to the exiles of their sin and their defiance to God, and the fact that the city back home is going to fall. And so that's chapter 4. Chapter 5, Ezekiel's told to shave his head and his beard and to take that hair, and again to do some things that picture God's judgment on Israel, that the nation will be utterly destroyed and famine will again force cannibalism in the city. And as you're reading this, like Lamentations, you may be tempted to think, is God too harsh that he's allowing these things and permitting these things? And you need to understand this. When we disagree with God, we are always wrong and he's always right. And that means there's always more to the story that we don't understand. If and when we ever think God's response to sin is too harsh, we merely need to remember we're underestimating the exceeding terribleness of sin. When you think that God's judgment is too harsh, just understand it's not the judgment is too harsh, it's your understanding is too minimal. You have minimized the destructive and terrible and horrible nature of sin instead of really understanding how terrible it really is. Chapter 6, Israel is judged and the paganism of Israel is destroyed, but a remnant will escape and will be preserved. And God repeats this message through these chapters. You're going to see it. They will know then they'll know that I am the Lord. What's he talking about? Well, they've got all kinds of false gods. They're worshiping all kinds of pagan deities. You're going to hear that in chapter 8. So God's saying, your gods are fake and I'm the true God, and you should turn back to me instead of running from me and turning away from me and rebelling against me. Chapter 7, the end is coming. God says, I'm going to bring on them the evil that they have brought on everybody else. You got to understand, the people that this is happening to were doing some really, really terrible, horrible, awful, ugly, horrific things in the city of Jerusalem, sacrificing their own children. I mean, we could go on and on. And so God then says, they're going to know that I'm God, and their gods are not. And then you turn to chapter 8. And while the leaders are meeting in Ezekiel's home there in Babylon, another vision happens, like chapter 1, and Ezekiel is swept up in a vision, and God transports him to Jerusalem, almost like an out-of-body experience or something, and begins to tour him around the temple grounds of Jerusalem and says, I want to show you some things. He shows him an idol in the courtyard of the temple. And then he takes him behind a wall and shows him a secret room in the temple grounds where they're worshiping paganism and doing terrible, horrible things. And then he takes him to a courtyard where women are worshiping a god named Tammuz. Tammuz is a god out of ancient Babel, the Tower of Babel, and the kingdom of Nimrod. And it ties into all kinds of ancient pagan mysticism and pagan mythology. And Tammuz is connected. Tammuz becomes later Baal, the god of Baal. And he's also connected to Ishtar, who is also Ashtaroth and goes by other names. Let me read you the names here. Ashtaroth, Asherah, Queen of Heaven, Astarte, Diana, Ishtar, Venus, Aphrodite, all the same deity. And Tammuz was her son. And so I'm not going to take time to go into all of it. You could probably Google it and look it all up. But here's what I want you to take away from this. All of the paganism of the surrounding countries had found its way right into the temple grounds of God's most sacred place and God's most sacred presence. So this is as wicked as it can be in the most special place. Okay, it's Satan doing his worst to spit in God's eye and using God's people to do it. So no wonder God is bringing judgment on these people after so many years and hundreds of years of warnings, which they would not heed. So this chapter kind of pauses us, okay? And what I want you to catch at the end of chapter 8, you're going to see the people undergoing God's judgment are crying for mercy. Here's what you need to know, though. This is not a repentant cry. It's a defiant cry, okay? It's an unrepentant cry, because if it were a repentant cry, God would have relented. And he said that all through the book of Joshua, okay? Same events, but the people would not repent. They're begging for respite, that God would relent, but they don't want to repent. They don't want God. They want their way. They just want God to stop what he's allowing. So we pause the narrative here with Ezekiel, and we're going to pick it up in chapter 9 in next week's reading. But again, I just want to kind of like encourage you. This is hard reading. It's heavy reading. You might want, so what I do in heavy reading, I read the Authorized or the KJV, but I also like to read the ESV and the NLT. And I'll tell you that you're going to find this a lot more readable and understandable in terms of its narrative value if you follow along in one of the more modern English translations that kind of flows with our vernacular. And so that's a good way to get it into you as well and understand what's really going on. So don't be discouraged with this week's reading. We're pressing forward. We've got now 9 weeks left, and I'm so glad you're taking the journey. Love to read your comments. Look forward to hearing what you're learning, how God's speaking to you. I think he's going to minister to you this week in your reading. And I just want to say thank you for taking time to comment, or some of you have stopped me at church or along the way or emailed me, and you've told me that this journey is meaningful to you. I cannot tell you how motivational that is for me, because right now I'm just sitting in this room all alone, looking at this camera, talking to you, but I'm wondering, who watches this? I know that some people do, but I don't know what it's doing. So when I hear from you, it is really meaningful, and I greatly appreciate it. Last thing I want to say is the Done book is available, and it's on sale right now. Why? Because we're celebrating the release of the Spanish version of Done, which is called Hecho. So the second edition is now available in a Spanish version, and I just challenge you to go to inthegospel.com and take advantage of the sale, which it goes through October of 2024. And when I'm recording this video, it is 10% off orders of more than 100 or more books. And that already is 40% off. So you're getting 50% off if you get 100 or more books. And these are great to give away at Thanksgiving or Christmas, and they're great outreach resources. So I encourage them maybe to hand them to your pastor or your local church, and we give them to all of the guests that come to Emmanuel, and our church family uses them to witness to family and friends and coworkers. However, God would lead you to use this little book. It's a simple presentation of the gospel, and it's available at inthegospel.com. Hey, have a great day. I'm praying for you all. We'll see you tomorrow.